So now they're heading to Peliliu, the next target. When the big fleet left for the Palaus to follow the bombardment ships, there was but a single somber note. Aboard one of the vessels were stacks of many hundreds of white wooden crosses, far more than a 2 days' supply. 2 days from Peliliu, there was a report from the underwater demolition teams, whose men had boldly swum into shore and inspected Jap defenses. Nothing serious, they said. The way would be cleared. Puller's mind was not relieved. He had never before felt pessimism at the opening of a battle. Now we're starting the invasion. There was no moon. The sky was filled with stars, and there was not a trace of cloud. Toward the dawn of September 15th, the transports had come into position. On the horizon, the guns of the fleet spurted fire. For hours, the thunder was unbroken. But as gray-edged the sky pace slowed and the fire became desultory. The island was invisible. Occasional flares erupted above it in the darkness and drifted from sight. The troops had breakfast before daylight, steak and eggs again. And when the first of them came to the decks, the chain of the Palaus lay in a black silhouette across the sea. There was a moderate swell. A breeze sprang up coming from the island of Peliliu. The guns broke into a full cry once more, and the final shelling struck target. The 2 assault battalions of the 1st Marines went aboard the big landing vehicles on the decks. The maws of the ships clanked open and the amphibious tractors were spewed forth, milling as they formed lines ready to move forward toward the beach. They were 4,000 yards out. Vast flights of planes came over, wheeling in from all directions. They dived, bombed, and climbed over Peliliu for an hour or more, and soon after the first of the bombs fell, a slow, hesitant curtain gathered over the land. It seemed impossible that anything living could have endured, but at last, as the assault began, a puff of anti-aircraft smoke flowered in the sky and a plane dropped in flames. Just before 8:30, the first wave started shoreward. Puller watched for the signal flag to dip from the yardarm of a control boat in his front. The Amtraks foamed away on the broad wakes. At almost 8:30 precisely, the vehicle ground on the sand. Puller never forgot the scene. I went up over the side as fast as I could, scramble, and ran like hell at least 25 yards before I hit the beach flat down. When I looked back to the Amtrak, I saw 4 or 5 shells hit it all at once. A few men were killed getting out too slow, but most of them were saved because they got out before we stopped moving. We lost our communications officer. His leg was blown off and he couldn't be saved. I looked down the beach and saw a mess. Every damned Amtrak in our wave had been destroyed in the water by the enemy or shot to pieces the minute it landed. I tried to get a line set up for defense. The wiremen were there fast as soon as I was, doing their job without further orders, and we lost several of them in the hot fire. Every platoon leader was trying to form a line of his own, just as I was. Runners were going up and down the beach as we tried to get organized. That big promontory on my left hadn't been touched by all the ship's guns and planes, and we got a whirlwind of machine gun and anti-tank fire. Puller's 2nd Battalion drove through a heavy growth of woods, now torn by the shelling, and by 9:30 had driven 350 yards ahead to the edge of the airfield. They tied on the line of the 5th Marines. Casualties were reported as heavy, but the trial of the 2nd had only begun. The new position was faced by an obstacle marked on none of the invasion maps, a sheer coral ridge whose sides were honeycombed with Japanese positions, from foxholes to gigantic dugouts of reinforced steel and concrete, some of them with 4 levels, each of which could be closed off with steel doors. For 8 hours, the regiment endured the most savage fighting of the Pacific War. General Smith had come ashore at 11:30 a.m. When the phone line was spliced late in the afternoon and he talked with Puller, he had only a calm report. We're dug in solid and we've got the 01 phase line all right. Puller made no mention of especially heavy casualties or of need for help. It was estimated that the 1st Marines had lost 500 men during the day. The first water that had come ashore in oil drums and was foul. Puller shouted his rage to the officers on the ships, bellowing for new supplies. Here's Puller's report. Enemy well dug in. Opposition strong. Little damage done by our preliminary fire. Hard fight ahead. Casualties over 20%. I've ordered no man to be evacuated unless from bullet or shell wounds. Request further supply fresh water. Ours still undrinkable. Men retching. Puller called division and talked with Colonel Selden, the chief of staff. He remembered the conversation years later. Johnny, half my regiment is gone. I've got to have replacements if I'm to carry out division orders tomorrow morning. You know we have no replacements, Louis. I told you before we came ashore that we should have at least one regiment in reserve. We're not fighting a third of the men we brought in. All these damn specialists you brought. Anything wrong with your orders, Louis? No. I'm ready to go ahead, but you know my casualties are 50%. What do you want me to do? Get me some of those 17,000 men on the beach. You can't have them. They're not trained infantry. Give them to me, and by nightfall tomorrow, they'll be trained infantry. Puller went out with a runner, stumbling through the night to find posts of his battalion commanders and pass on the order. We press attack at 8 o'clock in the morning. No change. Full speed. Use every man. He fell more than once and cut himself on the coral. Shepard and others left at headquarters noticed that the colonel was beginning to limp and that his left leg had swollen. Selden called back, "Polden, you got my orders okay?" "Yes, you needn't explain further. I just came back from my battalions. We're going to take ground tomorrow without replacements. We're willing to try, but don't forget we're just going to add 10 or 15% to our casualties." When the sun rose on September 18th, 200 of the 473 men in Puller's 3rd Battalion were headquarters personnel. Many frontline units had been decimated. Long before noon, there were cases of heat prostration. The blazing sun was hotter than ever. Faces and lips were cracked and bleeding. Salt pills became scarce again. Puller was optimistic, for they started the attack from high ground, but the crucial days still lay ahead. Hank Adams came by Puller's command post and found him half-clad in filthy, sweat-soaked trousers with a heavy beard on his face. "I'm coming back this afternoon, Colonel. Do you want me to bring you a fresh uniform?" "Hell, Hank, I've got no time for that. Every man in the outfit will get clean before I do." Lieutenant Colonel Lou Walt, now the executive officer of the 5th Marines, saw Puller at a command conference during the day. He was absolutely sick over the loss of his men. The enemy fought hand to hand until daylight, beating off charges that no survivor could count. As first light spilled over the ridge, the shrunken company beat back the last Japanese attack with stones, ammunition boxes, bare fists, and bayonets. Several of the enemy were flung bodily off the cliff and fell shrieking onto the splintered coral below. But they did it. At the end of the day, the regiment reported a total of 1,878 men lost since D-Day. The fighting went on without a break until September 23rd, when the 1st Marines rested in lines without advancing. They beat off several counterattacks and patrols pushed out 1,000 yards down the west coast without serious opposition. The regiment was relieved at 2 p.m. of this day by the 321st Regiment of the 81st Army Division. The new commander took one look at the forward command post Puller had occupied and ordered it moved more than 1,000 yards to the rear. In 9 days on the line, Puller's regiment had eliminated one major blockhouse and 144 defended caves and lesser pillboxes. Division reported that 3,942 Japanese had been killed in the regiment's zone. No enemy had been captured. Puller's total casualty of men were 56%, the highest regimental losses in the history of the Corps. The 1st Battalion had lost 71%, the 2nd 56%, the 3rd 55%. Headquarters and weapons companies 32%. General Smith, who walked the terrain after it was finally captured, said it seemed impossible that men could have moved forward against the intricate and mutually supporting defenses the Japanese had set up. It can only be explained as a reflection of the determination and aggressive leadership of Colonel Puller.